This video is sponsored by Squarespace. This is one of those videos that I've been looking forward to making for a long time. As a content creator who almost exclusively covers Legend of Zelda games, it's always refreshing to take a step back from all the theories and talk about something different. It could be one of my favorite series like Paper Mario, or a game I invested tons of time into as a kid, such as Mario Kart. So when you have a game that piqued my interest when it was first announced, while also being heavily inspired by the game that pretty much built this channel, let's just say that I was very eager to make some videos about it. Today on Nintendo Black Crisis, we'll be talking about a game that was released last year called Genshin Impact. Let's get right into it. Now, before we begin, I need to say a few things. First off, while there are a lot of similarities between both Genshin Impact and Breath of the Wild, there's also a ton of stuff that makes Genshin unique, and in some ways better. But the opposite is also true. There are certain aspects of Breath of the Waifus which fall short compared to Nintendo's open world game. Something else you need to understand is that both games appeal to different audiences, meaning that at times it will feel like comparing apples to oranges. If there's one thing you should take away from this video, it's that both Breath of the Wild and Genshin Impact are incredible games, and I highly recommend you try them out. And the best part about that is, you can start playing one of them right now. Genshin Impact was first revealed at E3 2019 and almost instantly came into the spotlight for reasons that weren't necessarily good. Let's just say that from the game trailer, it was clear that it got many ideas from another game, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which also happened to release a trailer for its sequel, so it too became relevant at the time. And for Genshin Impact, that ended up making things worse, since there were even more people calling out this game for taking maybe a bit too much inspiration from the game. But while both games are built upon a similar foundation, many parts of Genshin differ from Breath of the Wild. I think the main problem came from the way the game was presented. Like, even the musical score paired with the footage makes it feel like it's trying to copy Breath of the Wild's 2017 trailer. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and play both side by side, and pay attention to the music in particular.
The history of the royal family of Hyrule.
I don't know if it's just me, but the trailer's musical score sounds nearly identical, especially with the pacing. And to the surprise of literally nobody, Genshin Impact became a controversial topic real quick. It was a game with mechanics obviously inspired from Breath of the Wild, like the climbing and gliding, taking place in a world with an art style very similar to Nintendo's. In fact, one fan was so outraged that they smashed their PS4 in quote-unquote protest against this atrocious act by the company behind Genshin, miHoYo. Something that ultimately backfired as it was essentially free advertisement for the game. The best part about all this outrage is that apparently Genshin Impact will make its way to the Nintendo Switch. Eventually. But whether the system will actually be able to run it or not, that's a whole other can of worms. At the time of its announcement, I wasn't particularly upset about the similarity to Breath of the Wild, and that's because I greatly enjoyed that game, so the thought of experiencing something similar is quite exciting. I think Breath of the Wild was a fantastic game, but there are certain parts of it which, in my opinion, could have been executed better. And that's where Genshin Impact comes in. Don't get me wrong, there certainly are issues with this game, whether it be the lack of overall polish, or the fact that it includes mechanics often seen in gacha games. Oh, by the way, Genshin Impact is a gacha game. Don't worry, we'll definitely be talking about that in this video. Because while certain things are to be expected in these types of experiences, there are other things which really need to be adjusted. Like, I don't know, the resin? But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's start by talking about the similarities between Genshin Impact and Breath of the Wild. It's true that both games incorporate the same climbing and gliding mechanics, and it tends to be the first point people bring up when complaining about Genshin Impact. But the reason Breath of the Wild added this feature wasn't because it was a Zelda game, it's due to the open world, and giving players more traversal options makes exploring said world much easier. I don't think it's fair to limit these mechanics to one game specifically. In fact, I'd encourage companies to incorporate it into their future games. If anything, it would make Breath of the Wild have even more of an impact on the gaming industry as it revolutionized the open world genre. Now, as I said before, Genshin Impact's art style is very similar to Breath of the Wild's. But it's worth noting that the company behind Genshin Impact, MiHoYo, has had past experiences with this sort of design. Games like Honkai Impact 3rd, made by a company who began developing games based on their love of anime. And when you make an anime-like game, certain art styles will fit much better compared to others. Genshin Impact isn't ripping off Breath of the Wild's look because it's one that has been used in their previous games. And to be completely honest, I can't imagine this game looking any different. Lastly are the game's dungeons and enemies. I will admit that Genshin takes a bit too much inspiration from Breath of the Wild in certain areas. The player will encounter many enemy camps which are nearly identical to the ones from Zelda, and the quote-unquote domains you explore kind of resemble the Sheikah shrines. Genshin has its equivalent of Chuchus, Bokoblins, Moblins, and Wizrobes, but something I appreciate about these enemies is that for the most part, I really dig their designs. And the game throws in a ton of new enemy varieties, making the overall experience a lot better. Except for the treasure hoarders. They have to be some of the most uninspired enemies of the bunch. There's one dude who literally attacks with a shovel. I don't really see the practicality in this dude. On the topic of Genshin's dungeons, one problem with the shrines of Breath of the Wild is that they all have the same interior look. It would have been pretty cool to have some variety, perhaps ones found in Hebra would have ice aesthetics. This is why I appreciate what Genshin Impact refers to as domains, since some of them have very unique designs, especially the ones in character story quests. It's a small detail, but it really helps with the overall experience. I could go on and on about the more minute similarities between both games, but I'd rather get into the review portion of this video. One thing I greatly appreciate about Genshin Impact is that, similar to Breath of the Wild, you get thrown right into the game without having to slog through minutes of cutscenes. The story begins with a pair of twins who get intercepted by an unknown god, and depending on who you choose as the main character, the other gets kidnapped, and your goal is to reunite with said sibling while getting involved in all the shenanigans that ensue in the world known as Teyvat. During your adventures, you get word of an organization set on the destruction of humanity, a powerful legion of monsters led by a mysterious ruler. But, as Genshin Impact's story progresses, you start to realize that perhaps there's more information about the kingdom's past that's purposely being withheld by certain characters. That the true motives of the Abyss Order go much deeper than your typical evil organization hell-bent on world destruction. The story is one of my favorite parts of Genshin Impact as it leaves you with many questions you know will get answered eventually. One of the biggest criticisms Breath of the Wild receives is the way the story is presented, since most of the interesting stuff happens in the past, and much of the narrative is told through its ruins. Genshin also has a lot of story not seen in the game, but gives you enough in the present to feel satisfied. Many characters act the way they do based on their past experiences, and part of the mystery is figuring out the motives behind these people. The main focus of the game is still to reunite with your sibling, but along the way you get to meet a variety of people, whether it be Diluc, an individual who resents the Knights of Favonius but continues to protect the city, or literal gods. One issue I have is that at times it feels like the Traveler doesn't pressure the characters into answering as much as they should. The game isn't very subtle with the hints it drops about what really happened long ago, and at times it feels like the protagonist could have pushed a bit further when quote-unquote interrogating people. I'm also worried that certain plot points are going to be ignored in the future, and miHoYo will just hope that we forget about them as more of the story comes. There's not much to say regarding Breath of the Wild's plot, since its main focus was the exploration and open world, giving players the option to do whatever they want, whenever they want. But in terms of story, I'm really enjoying Genshin's, and might even make some lore videos on it in the future. Before we continue with this video, I'd like to take the time to talk about our sponsor, Squarespace. Have you ever wanted to make a website for business or personal reasons but don't have any experience? Well, look no further, because right now you can go to the link in the description, squarespace.com/NintendoBlackCrisis, and use the code NintendoBlackCrisis to get 10% off your first purchase. Having a website for this channel is something I've wanted for a very long time, since it's another way to connect with my viewers, and Squarespace makes it incredibly easy to do with its many features. You can add text, images, videos, or do what I did and set up a contact page where you guys can send in suggestions for video ideas. And since it's likely that Breath of the Wild 2 news will be at E3, now's the perfect chance to send in your theories and predictions. I plan on making changes to this website to make it more user-friendly, especially once we get more information on Breath of the Wild sequel, since I'll want to incorporate some of that into my site. I wasn't too sure where to begin with my website, but Squarespace includes many templates you can use depending on what sort of site you plan on creating, and has 24/7 email support in case you need help with anything. If you have any suggestions on what should be included on the site, then feel free to let me know down in the comments. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and there will be a link below if you wish to start your free trial and get 10% off your first purchase. That's squarespace.com/NINTENDOBLACKCRISIS, and using the code NintendoBlackCrisis. Now, since Genshin Impact is an anime-like experience, of course there are options to listen to a sub or dub, and when it comes to anime, many consider the sub to be superior. I personally have been listening to the dub the whole time, and to be completely honest, I've greatly enjoyed it. Of course, you have the usual annoying characters, and it's unfortunate that one of those annoying characters is your travel companion, Paimon, but after playing for so long, you sort of adjust to it. For the most part, the cast did an excellent job bringing these characters to life with unique personalities, and some performances are especially good. One of my personal favorites has to be Childe.
For the trials that we face are harsh, and our enemies are like kites and rattle drums, who shall become redoubtable foes of Mr. Cyclops in the marketplaces of Liyue.
Uh-huh. Kites are really fun, too.
This is, of course, an analogy. As they say, the marketplace, too, is a battlefield. So as your sales manager here in Liyue, I demand that you obey my every order. A refusal shall be considered a betrayal, and the price for betrayal is to be dishonorably discharged from the Liyue Institute of Toy Research.
The protagonist also has a voice, but they rarely talk in the game. In fact, most of their lines come from the introduction, and after that, they only speak on rare occasions.
The Liyue Qixing always repay their debts. And as you have heard, our eyes see far and our reach is long. Name your price. You deserve that much. Well, could you help me put up some missing person posters?
Meanwhile, Breath of the Wild's dub is good. It's not bad by any means, but you can tell that they were playing it safe since it was the first time a mainline game had voice acting. And honestly, seeing how well Age of Calamity's dub turned out, I hope that it becomes a regular thing for the Zelda series. When it comes to the gameplay of Genshin Impact, it's actually very different compared to Zelda. The game does have its share of puzzles, but there's much less of an emphasis on it, and the few found in domains can barely be called puzzles as the solution is usually something obvious. No, the part where Genshin Impact really shines is its combat. The best way I can describe Breath of the Wild is simple, and I don't mean that in a bad way. You're able to fight with whatever you can find in the world as it's filled with different weapons such as swords, claymores, and bows. If players are good enough, they can even go straight to the final boss and finish the game. You're essentially soloing everything in Hyrule with Link. Meanwhile, Genshin Impact is more focused on working as a team. Each character is categorized by element type and the weapon they use. You have spears, swords, claymores, bows, and catalysts, essentially your mages. A big part of Genshin Impact is swapping between these characters and creating what's called elemental reactions. For example, you inflict someone with Hydro, and then use Pyro to trigger Vaporize, which will deal much more damage. Something about it is very addicting, and certain combos can be very satisfying to pull off. But I can't really say that one is better than the other since it's completely different combat styles. But what I do prefer is fighting as a team as opposed to a single character. In fact, there are parts of Genshin Impact, such as the elements, that I would love to see more of in Breath of the Wild 2. If Zelda was playable, you could quickly swap between them and pull off some awesome combos in the middle of battle. And I find it ironic since a game highly inspired by Breath of the Wild could also inspire the thing it was originally inspired from. We've had mechanics like the shock and fire arrows in Zelda, but they're mostly for puzzles. And if they were incorporated more into the game's combat, that could add another layer of depth to the fighting. Genshin Impact also has a full-on EXP system, something that Breath of the Wild technically has, but it's much more important in the former. You use materials to level up your characters, weapons, and talents. But since it's a gacha game, it can get incredibly grindy at times. I'd love to see Breath of the Wild 2 include an actual experience system, but not to the extent of Genshin. If you could use materials to level up certain abilities or weapons, it would add value to the resources you collect. You could even include a skill tree like something from Horizon Zero Dawn, where you can unlock additional attacks and upgrades to health and stamina. Sure, this is a comparison video, but it's important to remember that there are great things about both games, and at the end of the day, it comes down to personal preference. Now, when it comes to the music, let's just say that if I told you to listen to the soundtrack without knowing where it's from, you wouldn't know that the game was free to play. Yeah, it's that amazing. Breath of the Wild does an excellent job with its ambient music. It complements the wilderness aspect of the game, and some of the pieces from the soundtrack are as simple as piano notes sprinkled throughout the track. But when Breath of the Wild's music is good, let me tell you, it's good. People criticize the game for a lack of music, but I wholeheartedly disagree. A big part of the game's appeal comes from how relaxing it is to play at times. Having music play at every moment of the game would nullify that feeling of exploration and adventure. It also would take away moments like this. But Genshin Impact, it just hits differently. There are moments of calm, but there are certain tracks that it's hard to describe the feeling you get. One track in particular, Stormterror's Lair, is worth noting as it's a piece filled with emotion and pain. And it plays at one of the game's boss hideouts, something that's rather uncommon since those tracks tend to be more intimidating. But when I first went into this area, I was awestruck with just how incredible the location felt paired with the solemn and lonely piece. At times I will revisit Stormterror's Lair just to listen to this track because it's that good. And this is only one of many incredible themes. I now find myself listening to Genshin's soundtrack when making videos, and it still blows my mind that such a soundtrack comes from a free-to-play game. Seriously, I cannot praise this game's music enough. But let's switch gears now and talk about the graphics and performance. I can only speak from a PC perspective since that's what I mostly play Genshin on, and I can confidently say that Genshin Impact looks stunning for a free game. It's much more vibrant than Breath of the Wild, which has less saturation in its color, most likely a stylistic choice since the game takes place in a post-apocalyptic world. I personally prefer the colors and visuals of Genshin. Part of it is because it's an anime-styled game, and I love anime, but I've always been a huge fan of the games with vibrant colors and simplistic shading. It's why I adore the Wind Waker remake for Wii U, and the bold outlines of Genshin make the characters pop out much more. It's the perfect example of 3D anime done right. Another example of this is Persona 5, a game filled to the brim with style. Now, when it comes to the performance, for me it was very good, but that's because I run it on a PC built for gaming. For those curious, I use a GeForce RTX 2080 graphics card. I will say that on very rare occasions the game would freeze for like a second or two, and I believe that it did crash one time, though I'm not certain. Now that's from a PC perspective, so how about consoles? Unfortunately, I've heard a lot of bad things about its performance on the PS4. I think they have released updates for the game which have improved it slightly, but I can't be certain. I booted it up on my PS4 and played around for like a half an hour, and there was a notable difference in the frame rate. I think Genshin is capped at like 30 frames per second for the PS4, and since I only play on PC, it was pretty jarring to suddenly play on console. And I'm not gonna lie, this makes me worry for the game's future on the Nintendo Switch. Hopefully there's a Switch Pro coming soon so miHoYo can release Genshin Impact on that. Now, in terms of Breath of the Wild, its performance is pretty good actually. In fact, I think that the only thing limiting the game is its hardware. There are some load-in issues at times, but Nintendo has a track record of optimizing games as much as possible for their consoles. And again, I hope we see a Switch Pro for the upcoming sequel. If I were to choose which one was more polished, I'd say Breath of the Wild. Sure, you're dealing with a lower frame rate, but there are quite a few mistakes in Genshin Impact. It's not uncommon to see subtitles not matching what's said in the dub, or my personal favorite, when characters' lines get randomly cut off in the middle of a sentence. This isn't the only thing about the game that feels unpolished. There are a lot more smaller things which can make the experience feel jarring.
Oh god, what is this? I didn't mean it.
Oh, well that's... Well, They did not think this through, did they? Because I haven't hit the text thing, so like he's still there. Oh, they messed up here. They messed up here. They actually messed up here. It's also worth noting that, like Breath of the Wild, the game is filled with bugs and glitches, but I myself have never experienced anything that game-breaking. Actually, there was one side quest where I was supposed to open an image in my inventory and nothing popped up, so I was forced to look online to solve the quest. Yeah, that one sucked. But a big part of what makes games so great is the replayability. I'll be honest, at this point I'm sick of Breath of the Wild, but it's not for the reasons you might think. You need to see it from my perspective. When I boot up the game for the 100th time, usually it's to record some footage or look for some interesting video topics. And after a certain amount of time, it gets to the point where I hate having to play the game. But that's not a problem with the game itself. In fact, Breath of the Wild continues to have the most replayability compared to most other games. The reason I got sick of it so quickly stems from the fact that I'm a content creator. There's so much freedom in Breath of the Wild that you can put hundreds of hours into it and still discover new things or find new ways to play the game. Genshin Impact, on the other hand, doesn't have that sort of luxury. You play the game up until the current point in the story, do some artifact farming and grinding for materials to upgrade characters, and inevitably wait for the next big update. It's a double-edged sword because it gets its replayability from all the added content it will receive throughout the game's lifespan, but wait too long and you lose interest. Now, to be fair, miHoYo seems to have a lot of huge things planned for the game, such as adding new whole regions to explore, and the story is only just starting. You know that main storyline with the dragon that was shown in the initial trailer? Yeah, after you finish that whole thing up, you realize that it was only the prologue. So the game's replayability really depends on how frequent these updates and events are. It's true that you can spend the time grinding for materials and artifacts, which in itself would be fine, but then you have to consider resin on top of that, which at the moment causes problems. For those out of the loop, gacha games are known to be incredibly grindy as a way to incentivize players to instead spend money and save time. Thing is, while this works for some people, there are those who don't mind doing the grind if it means not paying anything. And that's why another mechanic used in these games is a sort of stamina feature. A currency that regenerates over time and is needed to perform a variety of tasks which would otherwise be free to do. I mean, it's technically still free, but you're gonna have to wait. Resin is Genshin Impact's version of a stamina system, and it regenerates at a rate of 1 per 8 minutes. Unfortunately, this means that endgame players can't do much and end up using up all the resin very quickly. Hopefully MiHoYo will change this later to something more manageable, like 1 resin every 5 minutes, but as of now it's something that hinders the experience. Of course, there's many chests and quests littered throughout the world, and like Breath of the Wild, it's very easy to get sidetracked with the amount of stuff to do. It's very important to complete all the side quests and find all the chests since it rewards you with Adventure EXP and Primogems. The former needed to up your adventure rank and unlock more of the story, and the latter being the currency used for wishes. Exploring wasn't necessarily my favorite part of Genshin, as I mainly did it to progress the story, which, by the way, is one of my personal favorite parts of the game, as opposed to Breath of the Wild, where its freedom and exploration were the highlight of my experience. Not to say that it wasn't fun to navigate Genshin's world, there's much more variety in the landscapes, with one of my favorite areas being the tall mountains of Liyue. And yes, I am very excited for the new regions to be added later on. And one thing great about Genshin is the towns and settlements, something that isn't seen much in Breath of the Wild since it's a post-apocalyptic world. Again, it comes down to personal preference. One thing I can confidently say is that the bosses of Genshin Impact are phenomenal. Some are definitely easier than others, but everything about them is great. From their design, attacks, and once again, music. If I had to pick a favorite, I don't know if I could. Each one is so unique, and it's a blast to refight them, even if they die quickly. The only shame in being so powerful is that you don't have much time to listen to the incredible soundtracks paired with them. Aside from Thunderblight and Monkmaz Koshia, Breath of the Wild's bosses are kind of underwhelming. But that's something that most players already know about. I personally think that the bosses are a thing that Genshin Impact did brilliantly. And lastly, one of the biggest differences between Breath of the Wild and Genshin Impact is that one is $60 while the other is free to play. Now, don't get me wrong, there are microtransactions, but it's something that's optional. You can play Genshin Impact without spending a dime, and the best part about that is you still have the same experience as everyone else. There are additional characters that you can get from the gacha system, but any character is viable if you have the right build and team comp, even the free-to-play characters. Well, except for Amber. When you go in free-to-play, a big part of the experience is making use of what you get. Don't expect to get the characters you want without spending money, because the chances of that are low. There are plenty of 4-star characters that, if built correctly, can be as good or even better than the 5 stars. Yes, you might not be able to do millions of damage, but since you're free to play, that's kind of inevitable. I personally have spent money on the game, but some of the units I use personally are 4 stars that I think are great. At the end of the day, it's important to use the characters that you want to use, and not just the ones considered to be S tier or the ones that deal the most damage. If there's one thing I want people to take away with them after watching this video, it's that you don't have to spend money on Genshin Impact. Your experience won't feel different compared to someone who wails, and in many cases, it will make it much more satisfying when you get a new character or pull your first 5-star. Genshin Impact isn't just a Zelda clone. I feel like labeling it as such is doing a disservice to the game and the minds behind it. Yes, it's made a lot of money. Yes, it's a gacha game. But it's clear that there was a lot of love put into it, and if you enjoy Breath of the Wild, I highly recommend you try this game out. After all, it is free. And that's it from me. Thank you for watching today's video, and the next time I'll see you all is in the second part of my massive Zonai series. I won't give an exact date at the moment, but I'm hoping to release it around a week before E3. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a lot of work to do.